So Jeffrey Sachs just delivered one of the most explosive critiques of American foreign policy in decades. And we're not talking about academic commentary safely confined to university seminars or carefully hedged analysis that avoids directly challenging Washington's official narratives. We're talking about one of the world's most respected economists and former advisor to multiple governments standing before international audiences and systematically dismantling the entire framework of American regime change operations, arguing that the playbook being deployed from Venezuela to Iran follows the same catastrophic pattern that has destroyed nations across multiple continents while creating conditions for a potential great power war that could dwarf anything humanity has witnessed since 1945. On March 18th, during a presentation at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs, Sachs delivered what he called an autopsy of American interventionism, methodically documenting how U.S. operations targeting governments from Latin America to the Middle East follow identical patterns of economic sanctions designed to create humanitarian crises, support for armed opposition groups regardless of their democratic credentials or human rights records, propaganda campaigns characterizing target governments as existential threats, and ultimately military intervention justified through claims of humanitarian necessity or national security imperatives that collapse under scrutiny. It's honestly shocking to hear someone of Sachs' stature and credibility making arguments that directly contradict decades of bipartisan American foreign policy consensus. But guess what? His presentation included extensive documentation from declassified government records, testimony from former intelligence officials, and analysis from international organizations that support his core thesis that American regime change operations consistently produce outcomes opposite to stated humanitarian and democratic objectives, while generating refugee crises, terrorism, state collapse, and opportunities for adversaries that undermine rather than advance American interests. This isn't just about criticizing specific policy decisions or in questioning whether particular interventions were well executed. We're talking about fundamental challenge to the entire logic of American interventionism, arguing that the playbook itself is inherently flawed, that it produces predictable, catastrophic failures, regardless of how skillfully implemented, and that current operations targeting Venezuela and Iran are following this same pattern toward disasters that could trigger direct military confrontations with Russia and China in ways that risk escalation to nuclear war. And trust me, the detail and documentation Sachs provided is forcing even intervention supporters to grapple with historical record they've previously ignored, while triggering intense debates about whether American foreign policy establishment has learned anything from Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and other interventions that began with promises of liberation and ended with chaos that persists years after American involvement officially ended. Let me fill you in on what's been developing in Sachs' thinking about American foreign policy over the past several years that led to this comprehensive critique. Jeffrey Sachs is hardly anti-American, radical, or consistent critic of U.S. foreign policy. His background includes serving as special advisor to UN Secretary General on Millennium Development Goals, advising multiple governments on economic development and transition from socialism to market economics, and maintaining position as professor at Columbia University, where he's directed Earth Institute and Center for Sustainable Development. His credibility comes precisely from being an establishment figure who worked within systems he's now criticizing, rather than outside critic whose opposition could be dismissed as ideological bias. According to The Nation magazine's reporting from early March, Sachs's evolution towards systematic critique of American interventionism began around 2013 when he started publicly questioning official narratives about Syrian civil war, arguing that U.S. support for armed opposition groups was prolonging conflict and creating conditions for ISIS expansion rather than promoting democratic transition. Whether it was examining how CIA programs providing weapons and training to Syrian rebels were fueling sectarian violence, documenting how American demands for Assad's removal as precondition for negotiations prevented diplomatic solutions that might have ended conflict years earlier, or analyzing how regime change objectives took precedence over actually protecting Syrian civilians from violence, Sachs really began recognizing patterns in how American interventions were justified and executed that contradicted stated humanitarian objectives. His analysis made it crystal clear that Syria was following a playbook used previously in Iraq and Libya, where American intervention, ostensibly promoting democracy and human rights, actually destroyed state institutions, created power vacuums filled by extremists, and generated humanitarian catastrophes far worse than the authoritarian governments being targeted. But here's where the rubber meets the road. We're now looking at Sachs presenting comprehensive historical analysis spanning 70 years of American interventionism, documenting consistent patterns across dozens of countries where CIA operations, economic sanctions, military interventions, and support for regime change produced remarkably similar outcomes regardless of specific circumstances or stated objectives. The March 18th presentation at Columbia systematically examined American interventions in Iran 1953, Guatemala 1954, Congo 1960, Brazil 1964, Indonesia 1965, Chile 1973, Nicaragua 1980s, Iraq 2003, Libya 2011, Syria 2011, present, Venezuela 2017 present, and current escalating pressure on Iran, identifying common elements that Sachs argues constitute identifiable regime change playbook that American foreign policy establishment deploys repeatedly despite consistent failures. According to detailed notes from the presentation published by the Gray Zone on March 19th, Sachs outlined the playbook's standard phases. First, identification of target government as threat to American interests or values, typically characterized as dictatorship oppressing its people and threatening regional stability or American security. Second, implementation of economic sanctions designed to create economic crisis that undermines government legitimacy and generates popular unrest, while publicly claiming sanctions target regime rather than civilian population, despite overwhelming evidence of humanitarian impacts. Third, support for opposition groups, including providing funding, weapons, training, and diplomatic backing, regardless of whether these groups represent democratic alternatives or have popular support, with CIA often channeling assistance through third countries or front organizations to maintain plausible deniability. Fourth, propaganda campaign through American and allied media characterizing situation as humanitarian crisis requiring international intervention, typically featuring atrocity allegations that later prove exaggerated or fabricated, but serve to build public support for action. Fifth, diplomatic isolation through alliance pressure, UN resolutions, and international sanctions that present target government as a pariah state that must be removed for international community to address crisis. Six, military intervention, either through direct American action, proxy forces, or coalition operations justified as humanitarian necessity or self-defense, regardless of whether UN authorization exists. Talk about systematic documentation of consistent pattern across multiple decades and diverse contexts. Essentially, Sachs was arguing that American regime change operations follow template so consistent that outcomes are predictable and that template consistently produces state failure, humanitarian catastrophe, and strategic setbacks for the United States, regardless of whether target governments were actually threatening American security or oppressing populations. And this wasn't just theoretical critique or selective reading of history to support predetermined conclusions. Sachs backed every element of his analysis with specific examples and documentation from declassified records, congressional testimony, and investigations by journalists and international organizations. According to The Intercept's reporting on March 20th, the presentation included extensive discussion of Iran 1953 operation, where CIA and British intelligence overthrew democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh after he nationalized Iranian oil industry, installing Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, whose authoritarian rule lasted until 1979 Islamic Revolution, that brought to power anti-American government that has opposed U.S. interests for 45 years. Sachs pointed out the obvious irony. American intervention supposedly protecting democracy and American interest actually destroyed Iranian democracy and created enduring adversary, precisely opposite of intended outcomes. The operation succeeded in short-term objective of removing Mossadegh, but strategic consequences were catastrophic for both Iranian people who suffered under Shah's dictatorship and for American interests, as Islamic Republic has opposed U.S. regional objectives for decades. Then there was extensive analysis of Chile 1973, where Nixon administration and CIA supported military coup against democratically elected socialist President Salvador Allende, installing Augusto Pinochet dictatorship that murdered thousands of Chilean leftists and ruled for 17 years. According to declassified documents, Sachs cited, Nixon explicitly ordered CIA to make the economy scream in Chile to create conditions for Allende's overthrow, demonstrating that economic warfare against civilian populations was deliberate strategy rather than unfortunate side effect. The Chilean operation again succeeded in narrow objective of removing government Washington opposed, but at cost of supporting murderous dictatorship that contradicted American claims to promote democracy and human rights, damaging U.S. credibility throughout Latin America for generations. And let's not forget Iraq 2003, the most catastrophic American intervention in modern history, where Bush administration justified invasion through false claims about weapons of mass destruction and links to terrorism, destroyed Iraqi state, triggered sectarian civil war that killed hundreds of thousands, created conditions for ISIS emergence, strengthened Iranian influence throughout region, and cost trillions of dollars while killing thousands of American troops and destroying American credibility globally. According to Sachs analysis, citing costs of war project research, the Iraq War killed over 300,000 civilians directly, with total deaths, including indirect effects, potentially exceeding 1 million, displaced millions more, creating refugee crisis that destabilized entire region and cost American taxpayers over $3 trillion when including long-term veteran care and other expenses. The war was justified through a propaganda campaign about Iraqi WMD threats that U.S. intelligence knew were exaggerated or false, exemplifying how American regime change operations rely on manufactured threats to build public support. 20 years later, Iraq remains unstable. Iranian influence in Baghdad is stronger than American influence, and the invasion is widely recognized as a strategic disaster that damaged American power and credibility in ways that persist today. Now, this isn't the first time critics have identified patterns in American foreign policy or argued that interventions serve narrow interests rather than humanitarian objectives. And understanding the history of such critiques provides context for why Sachs's current arguments are generating such intense reactions. Just think about how during Vietnam War era, critics, including Senator William Fulbright, argued that American intervention was based on flawed domino theory assumptions and was destroying Vietnamese society while damaging American credibility. But these critiques were dismissed by foreign policy establishment as naive and dangerous until military failure made them impossible to ignore. The Pentagon Papers, leaked by Daniel Ellsberg in 1971, revealed that government officials knew the war was unwinnable while publicly claiming progress, demonstrating pattern of deception that Sachs argues characterizes regime change operations more broadly. Vietnam created temporary skepticism about American interventionism, but that skepticism faded as establishment learned to manage public opinion more effectively in subsequent operations. Then there was criticism of Reagan administration's Nicaragua operations in 1980s, where Congress passed Boland amendments, restricting support for Contra rebels fighting Sandinista governments after evidence emerged of Contra human rights abuses and CIA involvement in drug trafficking. The Iran-Contra scandal revealed that administration officials violated congressional restrictions by secretly selling weapons to Iran and using proceeds to fund Contras, demonstrating willingness to circumvent democratic oversight to pursue regime change objectives. But despite scandal and evidence of policy failure, many of the officials involved in Iran-Contra, including Elliott Abrams, later returned to positions of influence in subsequent administrations, suggesting that failures don't necessarily discredit interventionist approaches within foreign policy establishment. And let's not forget post-9/11 critiques of war on terror, arguing that invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq were creating more terrorism than they prevented while destroying civil liberties and wasting resources that could address actual threats. These critiques proved prescient as both wars ended in failure. Afghanistan returned to Taliban control after 20 years of occupation, and Iraq became an Iranian-influenced state plagued by sectarian violence. But despite these failures being obvious to any honest observer, the foreign policy establishment has not fundamentally reconsidered interventionist assumptions, instead arguing that specific operations were poorly executed, rather than admitting the overall approach is flawed. Now, it looks like Sachs is arguing that this pattern of failed interventions, followed by learning wrong lessons and repeating same mistakes, represents something more systematic than incompetence or bad luck. This is becoming all too familiar. Foreign policy establishment has institutional and ideological incentives to support interventionism, regardless of empirical evidence of failure, because admitting that regime change operations are fundamentally flawed would require confronting how much suffering has been caused and how many resources have been wasted on counterproductive policies. The establishment's solution is always that next intervention will work if properly resourced and executed. Never that interventionism itself is the problem. So what specifically did Sachs identify about current operations in Venezuela and Iran that he argues follow the same catastrophic playbook and risk triggering larger war with Russia and China? Well, it all boils down to how American pressure on both countries is escalating despite clear evidence that sanctions and regime change efforts are failing to achieve stated objectives, while creating humanitarian crises and pushing target governments toward closer alignment with U.S. adversaries in ways that could produce direct confrontations. The Venezuela analysis in Sachs' presentation examined how Trump administration and continuing Biden administration policies have followed classic regime change playbook, starting with characterizing Nicolás Maduro government as illegitimate dictatorship, despite whatever flaws exist in Venezuelan democracy, according to America's quarterly reporting cited by Sachs, U.S. has imposed over 900 sanctions on Venezuela targeting oil industry, financial sector, and government officials, with the explicit goal of creating economic collapse that would force Maduro from power. These sanctions have contributed to economic crisis where Venezuelan GDP contracted by over 75% between 2013 and 2020. Hyperinflation destroyed currency, and over 7 million Venezuelans fled the country, creating the hemisphere's worst refugee crisis. But despite this humanitarian catastrophe that sanctions deliberately created, Maduro remains in power with support from military and substantial portion of population, while sanctions have pushed Venezuela into closer alignment with Russia, China, and Iran, who provide economic and political support, allowing Maduro to survive American pressure. The Trump administration's attempted January 2019 recognition of opposition leader Juan Guaido as legitimate president of Venezuela represented extraordinary intervention in another country's internal affairs, with U.S. literally declaring the democratically elected president should be replaced by opposition figure who never won election, based purely on American assessment that Venezuelan elections were illegitimate. According to Sachs analysis, over 50 countries eventually recognized Guaido under U.S. pressure, but the recognition effort collapsed when Guaido proved unable to actually govern or remove Maduro from power, demonstrating that American diplomatic pressure cannot simply install new governments when they lack actual domestic support or control. By 2023, most countries that recognized Guaido had quietly abandoned that position, returning to recognizing Maduro government as practical reality regardless of U.S. preferences. The Iran situation involves even more dangerous escalation given that country's size, capabilities, and relationships with major powers. According to Sachs' presentation drawing on Quincy Institute research, U.S. pressure on Iran has intensified dramatically since Trump's 2018 withdrawal from Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action nuclear deal and re-imposition of maximum pressure sanctions designed to force Iran to accept more stringent restrictions on nuclear program, ballistic missiles, and regional activities. These sanctions have devastated Iranian economy, with currency losing over 80% of its value, oil exports declining from over 2 million barrels per day to under 500,000, and ordinary Iranians suffering shortages of food and medicine. But Iran has not capitulated to American demands. Instead, it has accelerated nuclear enrichment, bringing it closer to weapons capability than ever before, increased support for regional proxies fighting American allies, and developed closer military and economic cooperation with Russia and China. The result is that American maximum pressure is achieved opposite of its stated objectives. Iran is closer to nuclear weapons, more hostile to U.S. interests, and more deeply aligned with adversaries than before sanctions escalated. According to International Crisis Group analysis cited by Sachs, multiple former U.S. officials, including those involved in negotiating the original nuclear deal, have warned that current trajectory leads either to Iranian nuclear weapons capability or to military confrontation, with both outcomes severely damaging to American interests. But rather than reconsidering failed approach, successive administrations have maintained sanctions while threatening military action if Iran continues nuclear advances, creating dangerous escalation dynamic. As Sachs documented in his presentation, both Venezuela and Iran situations demonstrate core problem with regime change playbook. It assumes that economic pressure will turn populations against their governments and that supported opposition groups will successfully seize power with popular backing. But actual results are that populations often rally around existing governments against foreign pressure, while opposition groups prove unable to govern even when given extensive support. Meanwhile, sanctions create humanitarian suffering that damages American moral standing while pushing target countries toward U.S. adversaries, achieving opposite of strategic objectives. At first, some defenders of American interventionism acknowledged historical failures that Sachs documented, but argued that those failures resulted from poor execution or insufficient commitment rather than flawed overall approach. If interventions had been conducted with more resources, better planning, sustained political will, and realistic objectives, this argument goes, they might have succeeded in promoting democracy and advancing American interests. Libya intervention failed because Obama administration didn't commit to post-conflict stabilization. Afghanistan failed because Bush administration invaded Iraq before finishing the job in Afghanistan. These execution-focused critiques implicitly accept that regime change can work if done properly. But here's where Sachs' analysis becomes most powerful and difficult to refute. By examining such large number of cases across different regions, time periods, administrations, and specific circumstances, Sachs makes compelling case that consistent failure across all these variations suggests the problem is the playbook itself rather than execution. If CIA operations sometimes succeeded and sometimes failed randomly, that might suggest execution matters. But if operations consistently succeed in short-term objective of removing target governments but consistently produce strategic failures and humanitarian disasters, that suggests something systematically wrong with the approach. While Sachs was presenting this historical analysis in current case studies, he connected them to broader argument about how regime change operations risk triggering great power war through escalation, dynamics that could spin out of control. According to the Nation's reporting on the Columbia presentation, Sachs argued that Venezuela and Iran operations are particularly dangerous because both countries have substantial support from Russia and China, who view American regime change efforts as part of broader containment strategy threatening their own interests. Russia has invested billions in Venezuelan oil industry and views maintaining friendly government in Caracas as counter to American dominance in Western Hemisphere. China views Iran as a crucial partner for Belt and Road Initiative and energy security. Both Russia and China have demonstrated willingness to support Venezuela and Iran diplomatically, economically, and potentially militarily against American pressure. This creates a scenario where American escalation against Venezuela or Iran could trigger direct confrontations with nuclear-armed great powers in ways that small incidents could cascade into larger conflicts. If U.S. attempted military intervention to remove Maduro and Russian military contractors in Venezuela resisted, would that trigger military confrontation between U.S. and Russia? If U.S. or Israel struck Iranian nuclear facilities and China provided air defense systems and military support to Iran, could that draw China into Middle East conflict? These scenarios may seem far-fetched, but Sachs argues they're logical extensions of current trajectories where American commitment to regime change meets adversary commitment to supporting target governments. This was the moment when Sachs's argument shifted from critique of specific failed interventions to existential warning about how interventionist playbook could trigger catastrophic great power war. You see, during Cold War, US and Soviet Union generally avoided direct military confrontation, despite numerous proxy conflicts, maintaining understanding that direct superpower war risked nuclear annihilation that served neither side's interests. But the current great power competition involves increasingly direct confrontations in multiple theaters simultaneously. Ukraine, where US and NATO support Ukrainian forces fighting Russia; Taiwan, where US supports island against Chinese pressure; and now potentially Venezuela and Iran, where US regime change efforts oppose governments supported by Russia and China. The multiplication of confrontation points and interconnection of various theaters creates escalation risks that dwarf Cold War dangers. That's definitely not the foundation for stable great power coexistence or management of competition within bounds, preventing nuclear war. And then Sachs addressed what he called the cognitive capture of American foreign policy establishment that prevents learning from failures and reconsidering interventionist assumptions. According to Responsible Statecraft reporting on the presentation, Sachs argued that institutions making U.S. foreign policy, State Department, Pentagon, CIA, National Security Council, foreign policy, think tanks, and major media have developed ideological consensus around American exceptionalism and interventionism that makes fundamental questioning of regime change operations nearly impossible within establishment. Officials who advance through these institutions do so partly by demonstrating commitment to core assumptions about American leadership and responsibility to promote democracy globally, even when those assumptions are contradicted by empirical evidence. The result is that policy failures are attributed to the insufficient resolve or resources rather than flawed premises, ensuring that Playbook persists despite consistent disasters. In the eyes of Sachs, this institutional dynamic explains why America keeps repeating same mistakes. The people making decisions are selected specifically for their commitment to interventionist assumptions. And those who question those assumptions are excluded from positions of influence. The foreign policy establishment is literally structured to prevent learning from failures and questioning core beliefs, making it a self-perpetuating system that will continue producing disasters until some external shock forces fundamental reconsideration. Now, this left defenders of American foreign policy in difficult position, trying to rebut Sachs's arguments without simply dismissing him as anti-American or naive about threats facing the United States. On one side, Sachs is too credible to easily dismiss his academic credentials, government advisory experience, and track record of prescient analysis on various issues mean his critiques cannot be ignored as infringe radicalism. Attacking his motivations or patriotism would backfire and validate his arguments about how establishment responds to criticism. On the flip side, accepting his analysis would require admitting that American foreign policy has caused enormous suffering through failed interventions, that current Venezuela and Iran operations are following same failed playbook, and that fundamental reconceptualization of American role in world is necessary. That admission would undermine careers of officials who designed and implemented these policies and would require foreign policy establishment to fundamentally reconsider its purpose and approach. The tricky part is that Sachs' argument doesn't provide simple alternative policy framework. He's primarily diagnosing problems rather than prescribing solutions. So establishment critics can argue that while interventions may have failed, alternatives, like allowing adversaries to expand influence or tolerating authoritarian governments oppressing populations, create different problems that Sachs doesn't adequately address. This allows interventionism supporters to acknowledge specific failures while maintaining that abandoning regime change altogether would create worse outcomes. It's a fundamentally difficult debate because it involves competing values and assessments of risk that cannot be resolved purely through empirical analysis. And that's exactly why Sachs' critique is simultaneously powerful and unlikely to change actual policy in near term, despite its merits. This whole debate, triggered by Sachs's presentation, is revealing deep fissures within foreign policy community between what might be called restraint camp, represented by Sachs, and others arguing for dramatically reduced American interventionism, and primacy camp that maintains American global leadership requires willingness to use force to shape international order. According to Foreign Affairs Debate, published March 25th, between Sachs and former State Department official, the restraint camp argues that American interventions consistently fail, that U.S. cannot afford to police the world while addressing domestic challenges, and that multipolar international system, where America accepts limits on its ability to shape other regions, is both inevitable and potentially stable if managed through diplomacy rather than force. The primacy camp argues that American retreat would create power vacuums filled by adversaries, that authoritarian powers will expand if not confronted, and that international order that has benefited U.S. and much of the world depends on continued American willingness to enforce norms and prevent aggression. Things became even more contentious when debate expanded to whether Sachs's critique implicitly served Russian and Chinese propaganda interests by undermining American foreign policy and legitimacy. According to the Hill reporting on March 26, several establishment commentators argued that regardless of Sachs' intentions, his systematic critique of American interventionism provides ammunition for adversaries claiming that U.S. is aggressive hegemon threatening global peace rather than defender of rules-based order. These critics suggested that Sachs should be more careful about how his arguments might be weaponized by America's enemies. But Sachs responded that this argument represents exactly the kind of self-censorship and institutional pressure he was criticizing. The suggestion that honest analysis of American foreign policy failures should be suppressed because adversaries might cite it demonstrates how establishment prioritizes propaganda narratives over truth. If American interventions have indeed failed catastrophically and created conditions for great power war, saying so serves American interests by potentially preventing future disasters, even if adversaries also criticize those same interventions for their own purposes. Truth doesn't become false because adversaries also state it. The international reactions to Sachs's arguments reveal complex dynamics where different audiences interpret same critique very differently based on their relationships with American power. According to Al Jazeera, reporting on March 27th, audiences in countries that have experienced American interventions throughout Middle East, Latin America, and parts of Asia largely view Sachs' analysis as belated acknowledgement of what they've long understood about destructive impact of U.S. regime change operations on their regions. For these populations, Sachs is stating obvious truths that American establishment has long denied. But American allies in Europe and Asia have more conflicted reactions. They generally support American global leadership and benefit from security guarantees, but they also recognize validity of some critiques of specific interventions like Iraq and Libya. These allies want the United States to remain engaged globally, but exercise more restraint and consultation with allies before undertaking military operations. Russia and China have predictably amplified Sachs's arguments through their state media, with RT and Global Times both extensively covering the Columbia presentation and characterizing it as evidence that even American scholars now recognize U.S. foreign policy is based on imperialism and aggression. According to South China Morning Post reporting on March 28th, Chinese officials cited Sachs's analysis in diplomatic statements defending their own positions on Taiwan and other issues, arguing that American accusations of Chinese aggression ring hollow given U.S. history of interventionism that Sachs documented. Legal experts and scholars of international relations are noting that Sachs' critique raises profound questions about relationship between power and law in international system. According to American Journal of International Law Analysis, published March 29th, Sachs' documentation of repeated American interventions violating sovereignty and international law without meaningful accountability suggests that rules-based international order that U.S. claims to defend is actually rules-based order that applies to others but not to America itself. This selective application of international law undermines legitimacy of entire framework and provides justification for other powers to similarly ignore legal constraints when they judge their interests require it. If international law cannot constrain the powerful, it becomes just veneer over power politics rather than meaningful constraint on behavior. Former government officials are expressing courageous views on Sachs' arguments, depending on their own experiences with interventions. According to interviews published in the National Interest on March 30th, several former officials involved in Iraq war planning acknowledged that operation was a catastrophic failure and that Sachs' critique of that intervention is largely accurate. But they argued that Afghanistan intervention was justified response to 9/11s and that Libya intervention was a genuine humanitarian response to imminent massacre. Other former officials argued that even Iraq might have succeeded with different post-war planning. Suggesting that execution rather than conception was the problem, the diversity of views among former officials suggests there's no establishment consensus on how to interpret intervention track records. The implications for current American foreign policy debates are significant because Sachs' arguments provide intellectual framework for politicians and activists opposing interventionism on both left and right. According to Politico reporting on March 31st, progressive Democrats critical of American militarism and some conservative Republicans skeptical of nation building and endless wars both cite Sachs's analysis as validating their positions. This creates unusual left-right coalition opposing interventionism that could potentially constrain future military operations if it can maintain unity, despite different underlying motivations. So let's break down what Sachs' regime change playbook critique actually means for the future of American foreign policy and international security, because it's not just about one scholar's arguments. It has profound implications for how the United States understands its role in the world, how interventionism is debated domestically, and whether American foreign policy can adapt to multipolar environment of where regime change operations trigger great power confrontations. First and most immediately, Sachs has provided comprehensive documentation of consistent failure patterns in American interventions that establishment cannot easily dismiss or ignore, creating intellectual foundation for opposition to current and future regime change operations that will make military interventions harder to justify politically. The credibility and impact of Sachs's critique depends partly on whether predicted disasters in Venezuela and Iran materialize, or whether those situations are resolved without catastrophic outcomes. If his warnings about escalation risks prove prescient, if Venezuela or Iran situations do trigger dangerous confrontations with Russia or China, his arguments gain enormous retrospective credibility. But if situations stabilize or de-escalate, Interventionism supporters can argue his warnings were exaggerated. For Venezuela and Iran specifically, Sachs's analysis suggests that current approaches are not only failing, but creating conditions for potential great power war that would be catastrophic beyond anything those countries themselves represent. The policy implication is that the United States should abandon regime change objectives in both countries, lift sanctions that are causing humanitarian suffering without achieving strategic goals, and pursue diplomatic engagement, acknowledging that hostile governments may persist, but that coexistence is preferable to escalating confrontation. The precedent-setting implications suggest that future of American foreign policy involves fundamental choice between continuing interventionist approaches despite consistent failures, or embracing restraint doctrine that accepts limits on American ability to shape other regions through force. If Sachs' arguments gain political traction, we could see significant shift away from military interventionism toward diplomacy and acceptance of multipolar world, where America is powerful but not dominant. But if establishment successfully defends interventionist consensus, the regime change playbook will persist despite its track record, likely producing future disasters until some catastrophic failure finally forces reconsideration. The ultimate question is whether American democracy and foreign policy institutions can actually learn from failures and adapt policies accordingly, or whether institutional and ideological factors prevent such learning, regardless of empirical evidence. Sachs' critique implies that absent fundamental restructuring of foreign policy establishment and ideological assumptions underpinning interventionism, America will continue repeating same mistakes with increasingly dangerous consequences as adversaries like Russia and China become more capable and willing to resist American regime change operations through direct confrontation, whether his warning triggers necessary reconsideration before catastrophic great power war emerges from current trajectory, or whether warning is ignored until disaster makes it impossible to deny his analysis was correct, will determine whether his contribution is remembered as prescient wisdom that could have prevented catastrophe or tragic Cassandra that spoke truth nobody would hear until too late.